All right, I start almost every presentation off with the kind of same real quick overview. I apologize for folks who sat in the DBR one yesterday because this is a similar overview of this. But I think it's important that we look at the situation that we put ourselves in as a field. I'm a tremendous RTI advocate, but it's also a model that scares the pants off of me. And it scares the pants off of me because we haven't necessarily thought of the different tools so that we can incorporate this model successfully. And frankly, we've gone down this path before. Anybody who was in the pre-referral intervention stages in the late 90s or the functional assessment, functional analysis stages in the late 90s, these are really good ideas, but if you don't have pragmatic tools to do them right, you can basically ruin terms or ruin methodologies or technologies in the field. If I say functional assessment, functional analysis to teachers these days, anybody who was in the schools in the 1990s throws stuff at me. Anybody who is not in the schools in the 1990s has no idea what I'm talking about. They don't know the term at all, which is a pretty sad setup for something that can be quite useful. If we go back to about 2000, 2001, 2002, a lot of the literature is stating that special education isn't working. This is kind of an old story. Obviously, that's an overgeneralization. You give me a really good special ed teacher and a decent student-to-teacher ratio, and really good things happened. You give me a bad student-to-teacher ratio. You give even a very good special ed teacher 12 kids. There's not a tremendous amount they can do from them. You've destroyed the teacher-to-student ratio, which was one of the more powerful aspects of special education. I like our approach to solving this. If we were having difficulty providing interventions to 16, 17, 18% of the population, let's just go ahead and give interventions to everyone, right? If 18% absolutely destroyed the system, let's just open it up to 100% of the population. I think it's safe to say when you look at RTI and PBS that it's fair that teachers and administrators say, what do you mean everybody could be eligible for interventions? We can't handle giving interventions to the highly at-need kids. That's a pretty concerning point right up at the top. Number two, which is a real fun add-on, was the addition of No Child Left Behind. Right? No Child Left Behind had a couple of really fun phrases in it. One of them gets an awful lot of popular press, and that's the phrase of accountability. Right? Everybody goes nuts on end-of-the-year test and whether people are making annual, yearly progress. There are two other pieces in there that nobody ever seems to talk about that I think have a lot more of an impact on schools and will going forward have much more of an impact on schools. One of those was highly qualified teachers, right? A phrase that was just tossed into there. It's a beautiful phrase. It's like accountability. How can anybody argue about having highly qualified teachers, right? Highly qualified teachers are awesome. Not highly qualified teachers seems bad. Congress did what they always do, and they used a term which sounds really good, and nobody had any idea what that meant, right? What exactly is a highly qualified teacher? Is it a highly experienced teacher? In New York State, they solved this by simply saying everybody who's certified to keep their certification, they have to go get a master's. If you've got a master's, then you are a highly qualified teacher. That's been wonderful businesses for College of Educations all across New York. That's been a real economic plus. I don't think it's necessarily led to better teachers per se. It's led to a lot of really interesting master's programs. The other piece that was tossed onto that was this term which has become huge in our field, but it was that evidence-based interventions term, or the evidence-based practice, that we have to use evidence-based tools. Whether Congress looked at medicine and paralleled that or whether they just came up with this, we don't know. But again, it's a term that is very hard to argue with, right? We need to be using evidence-based practices. Again, this was not defined. It wasn't specified exactly what this meant. This is a term, to my knowledge, has not been consistently defined anywhere, even going on 7, 8 years later. But it was something that was thrown in there, and it's something that's very hard to argue with. If I look at that from a teacher's perspective, and all of a sudden I'm increasing the number of cases that I'm potentially intervening with, I not only have to do interventions with a whole bunch of new kids, but I have to do a special type of intervention, and I have no idea what those are, and I have to measure them. The accountability standards means I actually have to have evidence-based assessment for them, which I didn't have to have before, right? So we're not going to be able to have MDE meetings and walk in, MDE being a North Carolina and a Pennsylvania term, but we're not going to be able to have meetings looking at a kid's response and simply say, I think the kid's doing a little bit better. We're going to have to magically come up with some data source. At that time, there's a lot of talk about CBM reading. I talked a lot about this yesterday. Obviously, having some other data sources is not a real bad idea. Those two are concerning. Number 3 here is I think, the really fun point. Essentially, everything academics design in school psychology takes about an hour, right? So essentially, everything that we set up, every test we set up, every intervention package we set up, every consultation methodology we set up, we might get really funky and do a 30-minute block, right? We might get really exciting and go down to 30 minutes. But we seem to think that there's an hour to do almost everything. An IQ test takes about an hour. An achievement test takes about an hour. CBM only takes 1 minute, but if you do multiple probes for multiple kids, it magically starts to take about an hour, right? A BASC, right? 144-item BASC, how long does that take for you guys to do? Well, actually, it doesn't take very long for you to do it all, right? You drop that thing off and then you run like hell because you don't want to have anybody see it. But it takes the teacher about 30 minutes to 45 minutes to do that, to set it up. If we look at consultation methods to design these interventions, they're based on meetings that, if you look at the timelines, if you look at Jim Wright's overview for his SBIT guidelines, it's 10 minutes for problem discussion, 10 minutes for problem analysis, 10 minutes for setting up the intervention. It's an hour-long meeting to talk about one individual child. Right? If we're going to have this huge percentage of the population receiving some level of services, we can't be taking 30 and 45 minutes to come up with the interventions and to test the interventions and to have analysis meeting on the interventions. There's simply not enough time in the book to be able to go about that. We need to have models which are much, much quicker. We need to be coming up with interventions almost instantaneously at Tier 1, Tier 2, and I would even argue at Tier 3. We need to have assessment methodologies and data collection methodologies that essentially take no time, right? I mean, that have to come out of the natural environment. And then this last piece, and this is a piece that we're not going to really talk about today, but it's a real bugaboo for me in particular. We might want to actually have some sort of analysis methodology to make decisions on the backside of all of this data that we collect. I think our profession is is much more advanced in 2012 at rolling out effective intervention practices and collecting some outcome data. I hear very little discussion about how teams are specifically supposed to analyze the data and come up with decisions about whether children are actually responding to interventions. So what we're going to focus on today primarily is this issue of designing interventions and how we can select interventions incredibly quickly and ones that have a high percentage chance of actually being effective. I'm not going to focus too much on those other two today in a short period of time. Everything I'm going to do for the rest of the day is based on this idea of a reasonable hypothesis, right? And my approach to intervention, and it's not my approach to intervention, this is something that Brian Martins preached us back in the 1980s and early 1990s, is trying to base off of the idea that most failure to academic task or most failure in terms of behavioral presentation should make sense. There should be logical reasons for that to occur. And let me give you a story, and this is a story Brian used to tell. If we take the issue of a child who's having difficulty with reading, let's look at two different hypotheses for why the child might have that difficulty. Okay? Hypothesis A is that the child has some sort of brain dysfunction, that their brain is fundamentally different than the rest of humankind, that something has happened, and so that they are a biologically different creation that needs to be treated in such an individual manner that they are a unique creation that has to have a very specific plan for them. Okay? So we're going to go through process analysis, and we're going to go through IQ analysis, and we're going to try to figure out what is unique about this child that is different than essentially anybody we've ever seen. Number two, the first grade teacher was kind of a bad teacher. All right? The kid has asthma and missed an awful lot of time in kindergarten. Right? Was a kindergarten male and was a little bit behind. That, by the way, is the definition for almost every single kindergarten male on the planet. Was a little bit behind most of their female peers, and didn't happen to have a kindergarten teacher who was differentiating instruction. And so essentially went into first grade a little bit behind, and the first grade teacher was, well, we know that first grade teacher has a little bit of difficulty, and so we try not to put kids in that class that aren't all that great. By second grade, the kid is a year and a half behind, really, really pissed off because everybody's calling him stupid. By third grade, we finally can find out that they're a biologically different creation, right? We've now. Which one of those is more likely? absenteeism, asthma, not great teacher, terrible curriculum match, or that we have a fundamentally different biological creature? I think probably the environment. Now, I'm not saying that no kids are different. I think anybody in the room who has worked in schools for long enough has met the child that reads 100% fluently, buzzes through text, and for some reason has no clue what they just read. No clue, okay? You see that kid if you work in schools long enough. It takes you a couple of years to first see that kid, though. You don't see that kid every day. You see that kid every 2 to 3 years, and you're like, oh yeah, that's LD. That's what we were talking. Oh, that's the case. But you don't see that kid 8, 9% of the population time. You don't see that kid all the time. If we look at our approach to the way we think about disability, to the way that we think about kids that are failing, we almost immediately go to what I consider the sexy approach. Look, the truth is that when we come across the kid that's really, really interesting and can read fluently but can't comprehend a thing that they're reading, that's a really fun case for school psychologists. It's a really interesting case. It's a really sexy case. Crappy first grade teacher, not that interesting. It's also quite uncomfortable to talk about. The kid missed 30 days because of an asthma problem. Honestly, this is pretty boring stuff. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to say that if you miss 30 days of critical education in the middle of first grade, you might be a little bit behind. Right? Saying curricular match didn't line on, not that fun. Talking about the alcoholic parent, well, this is a little bit more interesting. And people who want to be psychologists like sexy solutions. We like to talk about bipolar. We like to talk about schizophrenia. We're not typically all that interested in talking about curriculum-based measurement. It's just not as interesting. The problem with the biologic-based approach is that it takes a wicked amount of time to figure out with those kids what's going on. And we can't do that with every kid. We can't do that with every kid with our traditional approach, much less if we open this up to the larger box of everybody. If we start treating most cases as boring common problems with boring common solutions, then when we come across the really funky fun kid, we can go nuts and actually spend a lot of time on that particular case. Otherwise, we need to be using the reasonable hypothesis, not the unlikely hypothesis, on most of our cases. All right. That leads us to the term evidence-based intervention. Evidence-based intervention really comes out of the idea that most kids are statistically probable in terms to how they're going to respond to a particular curriculum, to a particular group-based activity, or to a curricular individual activity. How many people were in schools in the 1990s or 1980s? Had you ever heard of the term evidence-based intervention in the 1980s or 1990s? This is weird. To me, this is a very weird thing. You go back to 1999 in the literature, and the term essentially does not exist. I'm talking School Psych Review, School Psych Quarterly, NAS Communique, state newsletters, etc. We are not using that phrase. We talk about interventions, but we don't throw on the loaded term of evidence-based interventions. Does anybody know where this stuff actually comes from? We did not magically come up with the term. This comes from medicine. Right? And there's actually a really interesting background on what evidence-based interventions are and where they come from, and a very interesting fight within that particular profession. Right? Medicine was facing somewhat of a crisis back in the 1920s, 1930s, of where they realized there were clinical techniques that had been used for hundreds of years that had varying success, but took a highly trained individual to kind of figure out and look at the patient and figure out what would work and what wouldn't work. And they started going through the process of developing evidence-based medicine, right? So essentially medical and surgical practices which seemed to be more effective over a number of experimental trials. We go into the 1920s, 1930s, and they start to have a debate in the field saying, look, is it ethical for doctors to do whatever the heck they want? Or should they have to follow the best practices protocol in every instance? And the profession went into a knockdown, drag-out fight over this issue. There was a tremendous argument about whether physicians should be forced to follow the right protocol versus following what their clinical expertise suggested. Okay? Now, this went back and forth, and they had conferences, and they had books, and they have discussions. You still in medical school can take classes on evidence-based practice and evidence-based interventions where they get into the dynamics of that particular debate. Anybody know how that was solved? Why all of a sudden? What do we do now, by the way, in medicine? Yeah, I mean, it's an evidence-based medicine. I mean, if your physician decided, hey, you know what, I mean, this isn't House, okay? If your physician decided, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to do something that makes sense to me but doesn't make sense to anybody else, it ain't a physician for very long, right? They got an awful lot of problems. They could be right every single time. They'd still get fired. Right? The way that this was kind of solved in medicine was insurance companies, and somebody had said insurance companies. The VA system ended up being the initial vetting source. If it wasn't evidence-based, it couldn't be used in the VA system. That moved into insurance companies. We're now to a point of where if somebody wanted to do non-evidence-based practice, they essentially couldn't get insurance reimbursement for it. They'd have an incredible difficulty doing it from a medical standpoint and from an ethical standpoint. Clinical psychology went through the same deal. Again, massive, massive fight. In the clinical psych industry, this was frankly a even more interesting debate in that therapeutic relationship is an understood variable that has a tremendous effect on whether a therapeutic treatment is effective or not. Again, solved by insurance companies. Insurance companies got to the idea of where they could fund 8 sessions versus funding 50 sessions. They liked that idea. Now, in most areas of the United States, if a clinical psychologist can't reimburse through insurance, they have a difficult time surviving. And so almost everybody goes down an evidence-based practice pathway. The nice thing about those professions is that they debated them. They talked about them. They certainly don't have perfect models at this point, but there's more of an understanding within those professions about what evidence-based practice or what evidence-based therapy is, and more importantly, what it's not. Our field, on the other hand, has kind of just dawned on this. And so all of a sudden, 2005, 2006, this becomes a term that's thrown about all the time. I often joke, did your state have a conference? Is there a pamphlet? Is there something that states have given to explain to teachers what this is? And of course, there's not. This has not been something that most state departments of ed or most districts have been able to front to explain to teachers what they are. And at least in my experience, what that's led to is people believing that evidence-based interventions are kind of magic missiles or some sort of heat-seeking Sidewinder missile that you fire it off and it'll take care of the reading problem, rather than just a statistically probable intervention that might work for a particular population. And that understanding or thought of evidence-based interventions is having to be prepackaged, having to have a particular saleable device. It has to be something that you buy and purchase from a corporation, something that you have to necessarily implement exactly how it is specified. These assumptions about evidence-based interventions are, unfortunately, I think, wrong and difficult. Just one quick question. Does anybody know where the list of evidence-based interventions are? I mean, this is a somewhat stupid question, but you mentioned the physician drug reference. I mean, you mentioned if we go into medicine and clinical psychology and counseling, well, not really counseling psychology, medicine and clinical psychology, nursing, emergency medicine, etc. There are books after books after books. Now, again, that doesn't mean that they're used perfectly, but these are vetted guidelines of what you are supposed to use and what you are supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. I somewhat naively thought that in 2004, 2005, that state departments of ed all across the United States would be building lists for their state. To me, state departments of ed struggle in terms of what they're supposed to do. I mean, what is the exact role of a state department of ed? There's a real balance there. But boy, I mean, developing an evidence-based intervention package for the state would have a tremendous utility across regular education, special education, ancillary services, etc. And it's one that they could get a group together to do. They could fund that particular presentation, and they could put out that information. I thought every state was going to go down this pathway. I've essentially seen no state that has done that comprehensively. And that's kind of we'll talk about that a little bit. The site that Rebecca and I ended up doing kind of came out of the response to that. So. All right, I wanted at least one pyramid in the presentation today because it's mandatory for any discussion now. As a fun joke on the aside, where do we start seeing the pyramid become kind of a ubiquitous part of school psychology? It's really PBIS kind of brought this in. And we were working with George Sugai on one of these things, and I asked him originally, where did you get these numbers? And he said they sounded good. They sounded like pretty good numbers. And I think that's, so whenever we see these, we realize this 80%, 15%, 5% is kind of for a fictitious school in Kansas. This isn't, I mean, if you get into a very difficult school district, it doesn't necessarily work very well for either a really tough district in the, for example, in the inner city. And frankly, if you're in a suburban school district where everybody comes to school reading and writing by if you're having a 20% failure rate at your Tier 1 curriculum, your school's got a lot of problems. So this is a heuristic at best. What I like to do with this slide is to spend a couple of minutes and talk about the differences in evidence-based intervention. And I use the clinical psychology or the medical heuristic, but there is one area where this falls down tremendously. If we take something like gunshot wound victims, okay, there are several ways we can minimize or prevent gunshot wounds in the United States. And we can do that at a primary, a secondary, a tertiary level. We can do that at Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3. How do we do a comprehensive nationwide or region-wide or citywide approach to reducing gunshot wounds? What would be a methodology that would help us reduce the gunshot wounds in some sort of large population? Well, or less guns, gun control policy, something of that nature. I mean, if we weren't allowed to buy semi-automatic weapons, that probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the history of humanity. So my one political statement of the day, I apologize. So I won't make any more. Right? What else could we do?
Safety training.
Well, let's save safety training, because safety training assumes you own what? A gun. And so, I mean, I think the primary methodology would be, let's get as many guns out of people's hands as we possibly can. So programs that, for example, try to reduce the amount of firearms or try to restrict who has access to firearms, we know are effective because we frankly have looked at other countries that have gone down those pathways, and at the end, you do have less gunshot wound victims. Right? At the two-tier level, or the Tier 2 level, we're starting to look at focused interventions on at-risk populations. And at-risk populations for people with gunshot wounds are people who own guns, okay, both within their family and within their closer groups. And so an intervention at this level would be something like, trading in vouchers for guns to get guns off the street, or gun training would be a great example. Okay, at Tier 3, you've been shot. What is the intervention? Get the bullet out of somebody's gut or wherever and try to save their life. Okay, think of who does those three things. Okay, this is national or regional policy. This is community partner events, some sort of training, something. That's a surgeon. These are not the same people. The people who work at Tier 3 are not the people who work at Tier 2. People who work at Tier 2 are not the people who work at Tier 1. We could do the same thing with AIDS prevention. Right? We've got national models to try to increase awareness, decrease at-risk behaviors. We've got targeted prevention for specific groups, and then we've got specific medical remedies for those who end up HIV positive. Again, totally different people who do those. In schools, for fun, we not only have no idea what these actually are, but we are going to do all three of them concurrently, which is a very difficult mental task to do because the way we think about these three stages are different. At Tier 1, we got to have good curricula in front of these kids. We cannot have curricula that are going to give me 40% of the kids looking LD, right? When I did my original internship, this was back in the early 90s, I was in a wonderful school that had a pure whole language curriculum. I mean pure. We were not allowed to bring a basal reader series into the school. I literally had teachers that were pulling Distar kits in through the windows because you weren't allowed to bring them through the hallway, right? And luckily, it was a low-income school. And as a school psychologist, I had the easiest job in the history of humanity. I could do 2 hours of assessment, and I would say, well, the kid looks LD, and we know exactly what the kid needs, right? But it was 40% of our population that were giving that profile. Okay? It was a terrible curricular match for that particular population. If it had been a wickedly rich school where everybody had walked in already knowing how to read fluently, it would have been just kind of a cruddy curriculum. But in that environment, it was a nightmare. Right? At Tier 2, we're talking about things like PALS, right? Of where we're trying to take groups of functionally similar kids. We used to have Title I rooms of where we'd have a teacher who was just really good teaching reading, and we'd toss all the kids in that room. and they would do whatever they did, and out would pop about 85% of them being successful. Okay? At Tier 1 and Tier 2, I simply want to be statistically successful. I want to be effective with 80-85% of the population at Tier 1, again, depending on the school district. Right? At Tier 2, I want to take that next 15 or 20% of the kids and be 85% successful with that next group of kids. At Tier 3, now all of a sudden, I can't really worry about percentages anymore. I've got to find an evidence-based intervention for Johnny. And Johnny is the kid who didn't respond to Tier 1, and Johnny's the kid who didn't respond to Tier 2. Evidence-based at Tier 1 and Tier 2 is not about individual children. We couldn't care less about individual cases at those levels. It's about maximizing the effectiveness of the groups, the large groups, and then the small group programs. At Tier 3, we have to shift our focus, and we have to stop worrying about the number of people who have guns and say, look, this person is shot, we actually have to fix them. So we have to shift from evidence-based at the surgical level for a gunshot wound victim is, did the person die? It's not, was I effective 42% of the time in minimizing the amount of whatever, right? It's actually focused on, were you effective with that individual child? To do this, we have to have a very different thought pattern in how we're going to go about selecting these different interventions. At Tier 1, Tier 2, we're going to buy packages that make sense for our populations. At Tier 3, we're going to have to actually find evidence-based interventions for individual children who have been resistant to the evidence-based packages at Tier 1, 2, which suggests they'll probably be resistant to other evidence-based ideas that we come up with at the Tier 3 level, right? So that brings me, Tier 1, Tier 2. What Works Clearinghouse has done a very, very good job at starting to vet large-scale curriculums. What Works Clearinghouse essentially only vets packaged interventions because it takes, frankly, a lot of money to be able to meet the criteria of What Works Clearinghouse in terms of the research they expect. The developer of or of Cover Copy Compare is not going to go through What Works Clearinghouse. It's not going to make sense. Chris Skinner down at Tennessee isn't going to come up with the package and the randomized control trials, et cetera, to get it on What Works Clearinghouse. Hoot and Mifflin, on the other hand, they're making money, a couple $1 million for a few studies to test the effectiveness of this is small change. That's one good California school district will pay for that in 1 year. Much less the entire United States of America. When we get to Tier 3, though, and when I say Tier 3, and I hate talking in tiers because they're acute initial heuristic, but schools don't legitimately work in tiers. And so I prefer to talk about whole school interventions, small group interventions, and individual interventions. Right? To me, once you get to the level of working and targeting an individual child, you're changing your perspective on how you do evidence-based intervention. It doesn't really matter if the kid is pretty high functioning and you really want to push him back into the regular population or severely autistic. Okay? You're now focusing on developing interventions for that individual child. Right? Treating them all as if they're intensive needs cases probably doesn't make an awful lot of sense. But, all right. So when we get to these individual interventions, I like to talk about 3 pieces of fine print, and I kind of like to think of these as those legal commercials, right, where they do the whole thing, and then at the very end they do the really quick thing where the person talks really fast and says, okay, no, or actually the medicine commercials are probably the better example of where they say all of those things, and you're like, oh my God, I would never take that, but then they got a 5-second thing at the end where you're like, oh, so it'll be okay, that'll be good news. I think EBI are kind of like this too. They're unfortunately a little bit more complex than we've made them out to be. The first one is a rather similar one, and it gets back to that medication purpose, the medication idea. Evidence-based interventions are validated for a specific purpose with a specific population. Okay? These have been developed to fix one specific thing, and they have been developed to work with, or they have been tested on, that doesn't mean they won't be effective with other, but they have been tested on usually specific populations. Frankly, when we go back through most evidence-based interventions, it's stunning the populations that they've actually been tested on. We have a tremendous amount of evidence, for example, on working with low-incidence autistic children. There's a lot of very good research on that. We don't know how interventions generalize from low-incidence autistic children up into, let's say, behavior problems of an ED kid. Maybe they do great, maybe they don't. We don't really know, right? Most of this is regionally based. There's been a ton of research that's been surrounding Oregon. There's been a ton of research that's been surrounding Tennessee. If we look at our major research institutes, that's where a lot of the research on evidence-based interventions have been based. I think Nashville, Tennessee kids and Eugene, Oregon kids have been a well-tested population. How that generalizes to Columbia, Missouri, or for me, more interestingly, go north an hour, right, and go into Moberly and some of the areas up there, how that generalizes to those kids, or Eastern North Carolina kids or stuff, I mean, we just don't know, right? The best way, I think, to explain this to teachers is to just use an old tool example, right? Is a hammer an evidence-based tool? We've got some data on that, right? A screwdriver, evidence-based tool? Pretty good. More new. I mean, that's a high-tech deal. I mean, it's a lot more high-tech than a hammer, right? So we got a nail and we got a screw, okay? If I've got a hammer, how am I doing with a screw? I know this sounds stupid because, I mean, who would ever take a hammer to a screw, right? But if I screw a screw in just a little bit into a block of wood, and then I pull out my hammer, and I'm a big guy, so I got a heavy hammer, okay? And I start wailing away on that sucker in a nice, excited manner. What is going to happen to that screw? Pardon? I mean, it's going to, I mean, hopefully it only bends. But if I strike it hard enough, I can snap that screw in half. Now, the screwdriver, on the other hand, I can do whatever I want with that to the nail, and it's just going to prove utterly ineffective. It's going to have no effect whatsoever. I'm not going to hurt it at all. Right? When we start using evidence-based interventions for the wrong, particularly function, but also possibly the wrong population, this isn't just worthless, but in some instances we can do an awful lot of harm. Right? Let me take for an example, and I think the best large-scale example of this is check-in, check-out. Right? Check-in, check-out is the baby intervention of the PBIS population. Right? If you go to PBIS conferences in Tier 2, you do PBIS, or you do check-in, check-out, or check-in, connect. Right? They're starting to talk about a break is better, which gives a little bit of a functional flair to it. But I mean, most of the environments roll out check-in, check-out to start off with. What does check-in, check-out do? What's the purpose of check-in, check-out? It gives specific adult attention on the backside of a child exhibiting appropriate behavior. Right? When check-in, check-out is done right, if the kid is a little pain in the rear for that period of time, the adult is supposed to cold shoulder the kid and get them out of the room as quickly as possible. On the day that the kid has been good, that's where you have the warm and fuzzy, heart-to-heart conversation, love you, you're doing great, and all that kind of jazz. Okay, now, I've worked as a middle school psychologist. Fun population, love middle school kids. Middle school students all love their teachers, right? The goal of most middle school kids is to spend quality, tight time with the individual who's been doling out their academic task demands for the last 2 or 3 months. Is it at all possible that you could get a middle school kid who is either primarily focused on peer attention or, frankly, is an escape-oriented kid that wants the teacher just to not pay attention to them, particularly publicly? What happens if we use check-in, check-out with an escape kid or a peer attention kid and systematically give them adult attention, which is a punisher for them, on the backside of appropriate behavior? We oddly train them to do what? Because when I misbehave, you leave me alone. Okay? There's nothing wrong with check-in, check-out. Check-in, check-out is clearly an evidence-based intervention. There's a tremendous literature base behind it. But unfortunately, if it's not understood to the population who utilizes it, specifically what the function is, you're talking about an intervention that can actually damage kids, that can actually hurt kids. I had a student who ran a really interesting master's thesis of where she took kids that were specifically adult attention escape avoidant and had teachers do check-in, check-out with them. And we expected the kids to explode, right? We thought that that would be, Actually, what happened was the teachers, after 1 or 2 sessions, stopped rating the kids poor. They just said they were fine, even on days where we could document they weren't fine. They trained the teachers not to rate them poorly. The teachers weren't stupid. I don't want these kids blowing up in my face. And so they ended up going off record with check-in, check-out. They fixed the intervention not to make it an effective intervention, but to simply not make it damaging. We've got to focus on what these interventions were developed for, right? Not this categorical, it's a behavioral intervention, it's a reading intervention, it's spelling intervention, etc. Number 2, this is a fun one. Love this one, right? Evidence-based interventions assume that they're actually implemented with integrity. Okay. Now, I used to just go just idiotic on this issue and jump up and down and say teachers have to do the interventions as they were done, right? We as researchers develop these with very specific protocols, and you're ruining my intervention by not doing it exactly as it's specified. And then I guess one day I woke up and realized, look, teachers are never going to do these interventions as specified. They're never going to do these interventions with integrity. They're never going to do these checklists. Even if they fill out the stupid checklist, it doesn't mean that they've actually done it exactly as specified. And to be honest, it would be kind of stupid if they did, right? Let's take Dibbles, for example. One of the original Dibbles cards for initial sound fluency was a pen. And the correct answer was P. Except if you're in West Philly, where it's because they're ink pens. You have to go off protocol to make that particular assessment tool work in that environment, and you have to know the local culture to do so. You've got to adapt that assessment strategy. There's no way Dibbles can ever, or any of these tools can ever, have a range of universal options to make this work, right? Interventions that make a ton of sense in Eugene, Oregon might not make sense exactly as set up in a different place or a different location. And so teachers are going to do what they always do. They're going to teach. They're going to play with it. They're going to make it fit them. What we don't do with any of our evidence-based interventions that I know of is actually tell teachers, look, here's the critical components that you have to do to keep this as an evidence-based intervention. The rest of the stuff is just fluff, okay? The rest of the stuff is just icing. You can change the icing on a cake and it still is the cake. You can change the accoutrements and have the actual thing still work. Let's take repeated reading, for example. What are some of the core components of repeated readings? Think basic. It helps if they're reading. It should probably be repeated. It's also assumed that the text in front of the child is at their current instructional level. Not a small issue, and a little bit more complex. The dosage of the intervention probably should be somewhat specified. How many times is this happening a week? How long is this happening? Right? Other than that, I don't really care what they do. It doesn't matter if it's comic books. It doesn't matter if it's on the internet. It doesn't matter if it's with a buddy peer or if it's with somebody from the old folks home across the street. It doesn't matter how they set it up. If they've got a crazy fish theme going on in their room and they want to incorporate their fish theme, go nuts. But we need to specify in these evidence-based interventions what the active treatment is and allow them to move off of that and change other things. Now, that doesn't mean they won't ever change a critical component. They might. But in my instances working with teachers, if you tell them, look, with cover, copy, compare, you got to do this, this, and this. You change whatever else you want. Two odd things happen. Number one is most of them stop changing other stuff because you've now given them the option to do so. They become a part of the process. When they do change it, they change it in interesting ways, though. They change it in ways that make a lot of sense for their unique local population, to the class that they actually understand. The other issue that we really need to start thinking about with integrity is an issue or a point that very rarely comes up in school psychology, and that's enthusiasm, right? You can do an intervention, and you can do an intervention, right? You can be really excited about the intervention. We understand that therapeutic relationship has about a 1.4 effect size into effective treatments. Well, likewise with teaching, somebody who is enthusiastic and believes in an intervention is likely to do the things that are needed to be done to maximize the effect of that intervention. Now, what that means to me is that we need to give teachers functionally similar choices that they can select from. If they, for whatever reason, hate check-in, check-out, we need to have other options for them that they can select so that they can actually buy into the intervention. You've all sat with teachers at some point in time where they said, all right, I guess, but I don't really like that one. Maybe the person hates the head of the PBIS team in their school, and so they don't want to do check-in, check-out because they did the presentation. Maybe they tried it with somebody else before and it didn't work for whatever reason. We've got to give them a range of options and not force one particular model on them, because if they don't buy in, the interventionist, the teacher in this instance, is not likely to do the intervention with the type of enthusiasm and oomph which is actually going to lead to an effective intervention. All right, the last piece, and this is a particularly nasty one. You guys all learned in grad school that you can't generalize from an N of 1 to 10,000, right? That you can't take small N analysis and then say it works for everyone. Did you ever learn that you can't generalize from 10,000 to 1? That the exact same principles exist, so that if you take something that was effective for 10,000 people and assume that it's effective for 1, you're making the exact same generalization error in the other direction? See, large N researchers like to talk about how small N research never generalizes to populations, but they tend to minimize the fact that just because it's effective for 100,000 people on average doesn't mean it's effective for the one target person in front of you. All of these evidence-based interventions have been validated over a number of studies which have resulted in a large group of children, and we're talking about it being effective over the sum of those children. But that doesn't mean that it's universally effective for every child within that population. If we take stimulant medication for an example, or if we take token economies for example, these are interventions that have very large effect sizes, yet don't work for 20, 30% of the population, or 30, 35% of the population. We don't know why, right? With the token economy, maybe the teacher just didn't implement it well. With the stimulant medication, maybe the child's biology, for some reason, we don't really understand exactly why those are working. It doesn't work for that individual child. But what's understood within these meta-analytic models is that if we take a bunch of kids, and some of them have effect sizes of 3, and some of them have effect sizes of 0, over 10,000 kids, we're going to have a very robust effect size. The take-home from this point is that evidence-based interventions are statistically probable interventions if they're used for the right problem with a relatively similar population and done with integrity. That's a lot of fine print, okay? But even if they're selected correctly, even if they're done with integrity and enthusiasm, they are still going to be slightly better than a coin flip in terms of their effectiveness. And if we think about the population that school psychologists for some reason have chosen to make their life interest, you have the kids that didn't respond to Tier 1, you have the kids who didn't respond to Tier 2. How likely is it that these are the kids who are also going to be somewhat resistant to Tier 3 specific individual interventions? They're more likely to fall in that population or that pot. Even if we select interventions, evidence-based interventions well, even if we do them well, we have no idea if they're actually going to work until we have evidence on that individual child that it's effective. Now remember on these back slides, and I apologize, everybody hates when people go back. You're like, we're halfway done, don't go back. That's ridiculous, you can't do that, right? Where I said at Tier 1 and 2, these are statistical statements over populations. Right? If I've got data on What Works Clearinghouse that says, look, this is a plus 1.2 and my population is somewhat similar to that population, I can say this is an evidence-based curriculum for my group. It should be effective for roughly that population. That pans out rather well with large studies or with large groups. The evidence for an evidence-based intervention at Tier 3 is documentation of an effect on that target child, not some idiotic study out of the University of Columbia or University of Missouri or wherever that said it worked on some other kids. What that data gives you is the probabilistic statement. Until you have data that it worked for your kid, it's not an evidence-based intervention for that child at the individual level. That's a huge flip and results in some implications that I think are somewhat interesting. We've got to select evidence-based interventions that make sense for the current case. They've got to be functionally relevant. They've got to make sense for the population. We've got to implement them with integrity, and you guys get my version of integrity. It's not the checklist. It's make sure that the core components are done and it's done with enthusiasm. We oddly need to collect outcome data. Crazy talk. And then we need to evaluate its effectiveness to decide whether we actually have an evidence-based intervention for the child-teacher dyad that we're talking about. Until we have all of these things at Tier 3, we don't have that. And that very likely means that we're going to recycle through a whole bunch of interventions with these Tier 3 kids. Now, anybody who's worked with really, really difficult behavior cases knows most of these interventions work for 2 or 3 weeks, and then you punt and try something new, and you keep recycling interventions. Right? You collect some outcome data when the teacher comes to you and says it's not working anymore, then you change it. Well, we need to be doing that with most of our Tier 3 interventions, not this idea that we can have a meeting and then come back 2 months later or 3 months later and it's been fixed because we gave them PALS or whatever some evidence-based package is. Right? So, again, goals of it, make sound decisions very, very quickly, try the select intervention, evaluate it, and recycle as necessary.